Hello, everyone. This is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today, I am on with Dr. Mike Licona. We're going to be talking about a debate he did with John West, where they debated the topic of inerrancy on Sean McDowell's channel. In this, they talked about the resurrection of the saints, or they talked about some possible problems that West thought of Licona's view. As usual in any debate, you don't have the full amount of time to go through full details and give the full argument for your position. And I wanted Dr. Licona to have that chance today. How are you doing today, Mike?
Oh, good, Zach. I do want to clarify, though, you're the one who contacted me to do
That's right.
this.
That is right.
It's not that I was looking to clarify, but happy to discuss it. I also didn't really consider it a debate with John, even though it got heated at times. I thought it was just a dialogue to talk about those things. But
yeah,
that
is correct. I wanted you to clarify, yes, because, and maybe this is a little unclear to you, but I saw a lot of stuff on social media where people just flat out did not understand your position, and there's all kinds of things that were said, and I looked at them like, Mike didn't say this at all. So yes, I think this is going to be very helpful for people. So anyways, so let's start it. The very first part of the video, Sean McDowell basically asks each of you, what are the stakes in this conversation? Why is this so important? So let's dig into that.
I think three things. One is the truth of the content of Christianity itself. If most of what we know, I mean, not everything, but a lot of what we know about God, about Christ, about the plan of redemption comes from the Bible. And so if the Bible is somehow inaccurate or unreliable, or the gospel authors felt free to invent new situations, new sayings of Jesus that he didn't say in history, or even new chronologies, and felt in service of a larger spiritual point that they thought were true, I think that does raise questions about what we actually know is true about the content of Christianity. I think two.
All right. So I was just curious your thoughts there. Did you have anything that you thought about that? I think in the debate, they didn't give you a full chance to respond to that. So I just wanted to know your thoughts there.
In terms of, I have a principle I give my students, and that is our view of Scripture should be consistent with what we observe in Scripture. So, I look at some of these discrepancies and the differences in Scripture, in the Gospels. And so what do we have? Okay. So you start off with something very, very minor, very simple, such as paraphrase. Okay. So if you're paraphrasing what someone actually said, it's not exactly what they said. So are you misrepresenting that person? Well, in a very technical sense, you are. But you're not trying to misrepresent that person. You're not given their exact words. You are paraphrasing them to a certain extent. So is that an error? No. Go a little bit further, where you change things a little bit, more than paraphrase. So at Jesus' baptism, he comes out of the water, and in Mark and in Luke, God's voice says, "You are my beloved Son. With you, I am well pleased." So God is speaking directly to Jesus. Now, Matthew changes it a little bit so that God's voice says, "This is my beloved Son. With him, I am well pleased." God is speaking to the people in the crowd, the witnesses, the onlookers. So what's happening here? Well, some would try to harmonize that, like the gospel of the Ebionites did, and say, well, God said both. He said it to Jesus, and then he said it to the crowd. But I find myself in more agreement with Augustine, who said, no, Matthew changed the words there because he was trying to make God's message there more personal to the readers of his gospel. And I don't have a problem with that. Matthew actually changing God's words and he's transferring the recipient of those words from Jesus to the readers of Scripture. Some may have problem with that, some may not. Now, Augustine did not. That's what he proposed. And he was one that really wanted to harmonize. But that's the conclusion he came to. I think he's correct on that. You come to something like, I like the example of the cursing of the fig tree and the cleansing of the temple. Now, when you read Mark's gospel, Jesus rides the donkey into the temple complex on Palm Sunday, and he walks into the temple and he looks around, but it's late in the day, so he leaves. And he and his disciples go to the Mount of Olives and they spend the night there. The next morning, they get up and they're returning to Jerusalem. And he comes across the fig tree and he's hungry. There's no figs on the tree, so he curses it. This is Monday morning. Then they proceed into the temple complex. Jesus goes into the temple. He sees stuff going on of which he doesn't approve. So he overturns the tables and he drives out the merchants and the money changers. He cleanses the temple on Monday morning. Then they go back to the Mount of Olives again, spend the night there. Tuesday morning, they get up, they're returning to Jerusalem, and they come to the fig tree, and Peter says, "Lord, look, the tree that you cursed has withered and died." So we find two stages happening with two things. Two stages of Jesus going into the temple, and two stages of the fig tree being cursed and then being discovered dead. Now, Matthew just simplifies the account by conflating both of those events. So in Matthew's gospel, Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey on Palm Sunday. He goes into the temple and he cleanses the temple on Palm Sunday. Then they go to the Mount of Olives. They spend the night there. Monday morning, they're returning to Jerusalem. He sees the fig tree, he curses it, and Matthew says, and immediately it withered and died. So Matthew, again, he's just simplifying the story. He's conflating the two steps of the two visits to the temple into one, and he's conflating the two stages about the fig tree into a single stage. Now, what is he doing? Has he changed the facts? You could say he has. Is it a bad change of facts? I don't think so. He's just simplifying the account. He's doing no different than, honestly, what a lot of us guys do. At least this guy here does it, and, I'll be talking to a friend of mine over the phone and recounting a story that happened. And my wife had been involved in that story, and she's in the background saying, it didn't happen that way. It went this way and this way. And, I'm thinking, I'm not trying to distort the story. I'm trying to, he doesn't care about all the minutia of the details. He just wants to get to the bottom line. And that's what Matthew's doing. And Matthew has a tendency to do that. One more example of that in Matthew, and there are several, but one more example is Jesus raising Jairus' daughter from the dead. So in Mark's gospel, Jairus comes to Jesus and says, "Lord, my daughter is about to die. Please come heal her." And so Jesus says, all right. So they head toward Jairus' house. That's when the woman with the hemorrhaging problem comes, touches his robe, and she's healed. And then as they start again to Jairus' home, servants from Jairus' home come up and say to Jairus, "Don't trouble the teacher anymore. Your daughter has just died." So Jesus says, "Don't worry about it, just have faith." And he goes and he raises Jairus' daughter from the dead. Well, Matthew simplifies the account. So Jairus comes to Jesus and says, "My daughter has just died. Please come and heal her." So Jesus is okay. They begin to head back. The woman comes and touches his robe. She's healed. And then they go to Jairus' home, and Jesus raises Jairus' daughter from the dead. Notice there are no servants that come up to Jairus and say, "Oh, don't trouble him anymore. Your daughter has just died." Why? Because she was already dead when Jairus came to Jesus. Matthew is just simplifying the account. Has he changed the facts? You could say so, but it's in a harmless way. He's just simplifying the account. Well, those, and we find this in the Gospels, we find it in other ancient literature. We see Jewish authors like Josephus and Philo doing this in the first century. We find other Greco-Roman authors doing it like Plutarch and others as well. They're doing it. Sallust is doing it. They do it. It's common. So it's like, well, if they're doing it, we would be surprised if the Gospels, writing in the same kind of literary genre, wouldn't we be surprised if they didn't do it? Why should we be surprised that they did do it? But for some reason, my detractors have a real difficulty, a very kind of, I call it a very wooden view of truth, to say that, well, if Matthew did that, it wouldn't be in accordance with the correspondence theory of truth, that truth corresponds with reality. So in a sense, you could say, yeah, the way Matthew is telling the story doesn't correspond with reality. Or in Mark chapter 1, I believe it's verse 4 or 5, where Mark says that everyone living in Jerusalem and the entire region of Judea went out to see John the Baptist and were baptized by them. Well, is that the case? Did the high priest go out? Was Caiaphas baptized by John the Baptist? Were every Sanhedrin? Of course not. That's hyperbole. It's fact-changing though, right? It's not corresponding exactly with truth. The meaning is, and we know that that's what Mark was doing. That's simple to know that he was doing. Well, my detractors would just say, well, how do we know that Mark's readers or Matthew's readers or John's readers would have known that? Well, maybe most of them would have. But I mean, I see these as common literary techniques that I also see in other ancient literature. And so I just have no problems with it. But I do think some have a very wooden understanding of what truth is. And they're not thinking of it in context of genre. And they're assuming that the genre of the Gospels is of such historical reporting that it's got to be according to every detail, or how exactly we would write history today.
Yeah, and for people that are unaware, I did a video with you on this very topic, Jesus Contradicted, why the Gospels tell the same story differently. So people should go check out your book, where you go into great detail on a lot of these different examples that you just mentioned. Now, one thing that I wanted to get your explicit thoughts on was West seems to basically say, hey, if your view is true on a lot of these things, then that means that, well, Christianity, a lot of what we know about Christianity is not true. And it seems your response is to say, well, we should just take it, what we can know, and just take it as it is. And that might make people feel uncomfortable, or that, I guess, for a lot of people might make people conclude, well, it can't be true that what we know about Christianity and its reliability, what you're saying can't be true, because I guess in some backward way, because we know Christianity is true. Could you comment on that specifically? Like, I guess more specifically, how can we conclude Christianity is true and the stuff we know about Christianity while also taking a view like yours?
Well, just think about some of the examples I provided, okay? Does it really matter if Jairus' daughter was about to die when he approached Jesus, or if she was already dead? Does that change anything? Does that cause us to question whether Scripture is divinely inspired or is telling the truth? What if Matthew conflated the two temple visits into one? I mean, even Norman Geisler and Thomas Howe, if you look at their big book of Bible difficulties, they acknowledge that this is what Matthew did. He moved the temple cleansing from Monday to Sunday. So if that happened, and let's say Matthew conflated the two things about the fig tree into one and narrated as though it withered and died on the spot, how does that compromise the truth of Christianity? If I'm doing the same kind of things like conflating, simplifying, transferring, and my wife hears me doing this in a telephone conversation, Is she going to conclude that she can't trust a thing that I can say, that I'm a totally unreliable witness? Of course not.
Yeah. Yeah. So, in other words, well, let me put it this way. The reason you accept Christianity is not based on how you're reading the story about Jairus's daughter. You accept it for other reasons. So, when we're talking about these different literary techniques that the writers are using, we don't need to conclude that it all is a non-historical just because of specific literary techniques.
Yeah.
All right, so let's keep going here. Did you have anything to add?
No, that's
Okay.
fine.
It raises a question about the very concept of truth. And I would say that some of these ideas, not the ideas that the gospel writers use compositional devices or use things like ordinary paraphrase or ordinary compression, or I mean, that was actually talked about even at the time of Augustine. So I mean, that's not new. It is. I do think that Mike has given a deeper, richer appreciation for that. But when you get into the area of, again, gospel writers feeling free to invent new sayings of Jesus, new situations, new events that didn't occur, I think that really dovetails with a very postmodern view of truth that I think is ultimately destructive.
All right, so I'll be honest, I'm no philosopher or sociologist, so I'm not even sure what he means by postmodern view of truth, or why that would be destructive. But what do you think about that? Do you think that your view is dangerous because of this dovetailing into postmodern view of truth?
No, not at all. Now, when we talk about a postmodern view of history, and there's a scale. Okay, so you have your radical postmodernist, and then you have more moderate postmodernist historians. Basically, historians and philosophers of history will look at, well, how do we understand the past? How do we come to know the past? The past is the past. We can't get into a time machine, return to it, and verify our conclusions about it. So how do we know about it? And so postmodernists will say, well, we learn about the past largely through the reports of others. Of course, there's the artifacts and things like that, but we largely learn about the past through the reports of others. So how do we know that Julius Caesar was assassinated? How do we know what happened on that day? Well, it's because you have a number of ancient historians who report it. Appian, Cicero, Dio Livy, Nicolaus, Plutarch, and some others. So they're reporting about the assassination of Caesar, but they're coming at it from different perspectives. So someone like Cicero, he did not love Caesar. And during the Civil War, at first, he sided with Pompey. And then when everything was lost on Pompey's side, then he went over to Caesar and asked forgiveness. So there was no love lost there, I suppose, on Cicero's part when Caesar was executed. And then you have others who, what did they think about Caesar? What did Antony think when Caesar was assassinated? So Plutarch is trying to write from the viewpoint of all these different people, but he's got his own moral biases, and he's writing through a particular lens. Tacitus, let's say, when he's writing about the annals of Rome or about his father-in-law, Agricola, he's got his own biases. And so we are reading it through the biases of a particular author. And if that author was not an eyewitness, like Plutarch was not in most of the things of which he writes, he is relying on what someone else wrote. And so like Asinius Pollio wrote a lot about what happened with the turn of the Republic and like Caesar's crossing the Rubicon. Pollio was probably Plutarch's source on that. So, but Pollio's coming from a little different view. So, in other words, We come as historians, when I'm studying Plutarch, I'm coming with my own biases and worldview and way of reading it, and presuppositions. But I'm reading it through my lens and trying to read it accurate through Plutarch's lens, through Palio's lens, to get back to an event. And so what postmodernists are going to say is you have interpretation of interpretation of interpretation of an event that we can't get back to. And so who can know the past? Whereas someone who's a critical realist historian like myself, we would say, well, we can't get back, but we can make really good guesses, informed guesses. And some guesses are more accurate than others. A radical postmodernist would say it's all historical fiction, equally. And so that's kind of like postmodern knowledge and approaches to history within history. Of course, that's not what I'm doing here.
Right.
So when he says, I think that they're inventing stories, they're inventing sayings. I want to put that in context. What we're referring to there is some things about the Gospel of John. And as I pointed out in my book and, in that interview, that dialogue with John, that many evangelical scholars, very strong evangelical scholars whose conservative views are beyond doubt, they hold similar views about John. So, for example, Craig Keener, one of the foremost Johannine specialists, and wrote a fantastic commentary on it, says that all Johannine specialists acknowledge some degree of Johannine adaptation. I mentioned F.F. Bruce, who said that John has taken the Jesus tradition and has recast it as an expanded paraphrase, a translation of the freest kind, a transposition into another key, and so much more. D.A. Carson, that John has rewritten the whole. I like what Blomberg says. I think I like the way he puts it. Now, he takes the rating system of the Jesus Seminar. Now, that doesn't mean that he's in agreement with the Jesus Seminar, but the rating system that they had was they take the sayings and deeds of Jesus and they voted on them, and they had 4 color beads. They had red, pink, gray, and black. Red means if they dropped a red bead in there, it meant that particular scholar thinks that Jesus did say that. If that scholar thought that Jesus said something very close to this, not beyond paraphrase, but something very close to this, then they gave it a pink bead. If they thought that Jesus did not say this, but that he did communicate something, the gist of what the thought that was behind this, then they dropped in a gray bead. And if they didn't think that Jesus said this or even communicated the particular teaching in which this appears, well, then they gave it a black bead. So then Craig Blomberg, again, very conservative, a scholar that some of my critics often appeal to. And if you read his book, Jesus the Purifier, which is about the Gospel of John as well, and is one of his more recent books, he says, using that system, we take Jesus' teachings, his sayings in John, and we can say, few are red, much is pink, some are gray, but nothing is demonstrably black. Let me say that again. Few are red, meaning he's saying that only a few of Jesus' teachings reported by John are using Jesus's words, something that's very close to his own words. Much is pink. So it's a loose paraphrase. Some is gray. In other words, he thinks that John has taken and reworked Jesus' teachings so that the thought is communicated, but not the words at all. It'd be kind of like what F.F. Bruce said a transposition into another key, right? And then he says, but nothing is demonstrably black. So I agree with him there. I think he's right. Paul Anderson, maybe the foremost johannine expert in the world, and he's a strong conservative, he says that John has given us a theological paraphrase of Jesus' teachings on many occasions. So again, the thing that I acknowledge, I am not a johannine specialist. You know, I've read through John's gospel a bunch of times. I've read it in Greek a bunch of times. I find that the language that's used in John, the way Jesus, the doctrinally it's the same as what we find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic gospels, but he really sounds different than he does in those other gospels on most occasions. And he sounds a lot like John does in 1 John. So, you know, that's something that most readers, if they just read it carefully a few times, they can recognize that. You can recognize that in English, but it's even more apparent in Greek. So again, I'm not a johannine specialist, but I can see enough just through reading it enough times that something different is going on in John than what you find in the synoptics. So when I see people like Craig Blomberg, Craig Keener, Paul Anderson, and others who have spent decades in the text and really, you know, focused on this, I think we have stuff we can learn from them.
Yeah, so that brings us to something we'll talk about later, but it really says that you're not saying anything just entirely brand new. Now, you do have some individual arguments that maybe other people before you might not have held.
And
but
applying this to like Plutarch, and
Right.
I introduced some things that some others haven't been talking about.
Right.
But a lot of the stuff have been around for a long, you know, evangelical scholars have been talking about it for some time.
Right. And that I can confirm that as well. Someone who interviews scholars quite often. When I've talked to people, what you're saying is nothing crazy at all in evangelical scholarship. So you talked about how you don't really see your approach as anything of some kind of like postmodern view necessarily, or he doesn't even specifically say what's dangerous about it. So I don't even know what he thinks could be dangerous. But it seems like maybe he's either misunderstood the coincidences or the results of your methodology, or maybe just doesn't know what methodology you hold. But anyways, maybe later we'll find out more in other work that he does or something like that about what he actually thinks on that. So on the next part of this clip, it's like 3-minute long. He goes into big details about how he was in a faculty position for 12 years where all these Bible theology people, they rejected historic inerrancy. So he's basically saying, hey, he rejected historic inerrancy, and I guess he's kind of grouping it in your view as well. Like, but he's trying to say something like, hey, they took a similar view that you do, and he saw that there were all kinds of negative consequences of people leaving the faith and stuff like that. And he says, hey, it must have been because they were taking a view like you have, Mike. So I'm just curious. And he also talks about how something along the lines of, because they took your view of inerrancy, they also rejected the biblical view of marriage between one man and one woman. So he's saying that, hey, you are a Christian and you don't take this view on, or you accept the traditional view of marriage, but he's just saying that, hey, if people take your view, it's going to be all dangerous, bad things like he's seen in the past. So I don't really know how you even respond to that, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are. Is that something that you've seen when people take your view? Do you see all kinds of people leaving the faith because of your view, or what do you think?
I haven't personally. You know, now I know there's a lot of New Testament scholars that, you know, are held by many evangelicals in very high regard. People like N.T. Wright, Richard Bauckham, Craig Evans. I mean, the list could go on. They don't hold inerrancy, the traditional view of inerrancy. as it's understood in the United States and North America today. They don't hold it that way, but
Mhm.
I don't see them caving in on moral issues and saying same-sex marriage is okay and things like that. I don't know the story about the professors that he taught with
Mhm.
out at that university, so I really can't say anything. I don't know anything about their journeys.
Yep.
What I can say is I've received emails from many people after they read either one of my 2 books on gospel differences, like the recent one, Jesus Contradicted, or the first one that came out in 2017, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? And they've told me how encouraging this has been to them.
Mhm.
How so back then, I think it was 2019 or 2018, I had a debate on how to understand inerrancy with my good friend Richard Howe. I was invited to debate him, and it's like, Richard and I are friends, and yeah, we don't agree on this, but I know that we can have a collegial debate.
Mhm.
And so I agreed to do it. And I went into the Lion's Den because it was the annual apologetics conference for Southern Evangelical Seminary.
Mhm.
But after it was over, I can tell you that Gary Habermas, he attended it, and people came up to him afterward and he'd asked him, "What do you think?" And then my friend Jorge Gill, which I only knew him a little bit at the time, we've since become friends.
Mhm.
He was he handles the podcast now for Frank Turek, and he's done it for a long time. He's really good at this social media stuff, and he went around asking people, "So, what did you think?" Now, most of these people, uh, they would have been against me because they were they were like Norman Geisler fans. But both Jorge and Gary said every single person they talked to said something to the tune of, "I came in to watch the debate tonight, and I had a bad view of Licona. I'm leaving this debate believing and taking his view now."
Oh, wow.
So and I had 2 female students who came up to me afterward, and they said, "Wow, this stuff really helps us as college students in defending our faith." The next morning, I got up and I had an email from a guy. I forgot his name now. I think it was James. I put him in. I listed in Jesus Contradicted. But the next morning, I got up and I had this email from this guy, and he said he used to be in youth ministry, and the thing about gospel differences just really hurt his faith, and he didn't like how other evangelicals were dealing with it, and he ended up leaving the ministry, and
Hmm.
he was now finishing up a master's degree in history at Johns Hopkins University, or maybe it was, no, I'm sorry. He was finishing up a bachelor's degree in history at Johns Hopkins University. And he ended up going on and getting a master's degree in history at Cambridge. But he said, "Look, I walked away from the ministry. It really, this really hurt my faith when I saw the differences and how people were trying to resolve them." He says, "But after hearing and seeing this debate, watching it
Mhm.
tonight, you've reestablished my confidence in the Gospels." And so, yeah, some good stuff. I mean, I've got several testimonies like that from people.
Yeah.
So I've seen just the opposite happen.
Mhm.
Now, that's not to say that there's not going to be someone out there who goes the opposite way. I mean, they could look and say, "Yeah, I read Licona's book and it rocked my faith, and I end up going down the slippery slope, and I ended up losing my faith as a result." I mean, that's entirely possible.
Mhm.
But I think it's the very brittle, rigid view of inspiration that leads to certain views of inerrancy that sets a person up for that.
Mhm.
Because if it's kind of like, well, since the Bible is God's word, it's God's speech in written form. If there's one error in it, then we can't trust any of it. And I just think that that's poor thinking. And when you teach that to a person, and that kind of really rigid view of inerrancy, you're setting that person up for a fall.
Right. And that is really interesting, because Wes is saying, hey, when these students come across these professors who don't believe a traditional view of inerrancy, whatever that means, that these students are leaving the faith. And he's blaming it the views of inerrancy. But my question is, well, isn't it more likely that the reason they're rejecting the faith is because someone prior to them told them, hey, you are going to reject the faith if you take a view like this, or if you have to reject the traditional view of inerrancy? So you're actually, in a lot of ways, saying, hey, you can be a Christian and take this view on the Gospels, while Wes is saying, no, you can't be a Christian if you take this view on the Gospels.
No, I think he would say, I mean, he says I'm a Christian, right?
Well, no, what he would say is the logical conclusion is that we have to doubt a lot about what Jesus says, and naturally it's going to cause you to accept all these, bad views about, marriage and stuff like that. But no, you're right. He does think you're a Christian, but I guess but I do think that he probably would say that you're being contradictory in some way.
Perhaps.
Yeah. But yeah, and there's a lot more that could be said there. But anyway, so those are the three things that he says are the main big problems with your view as far as negative consequences. And in this discussion, Sean says, hey, what do you think, Mike? How do you respond? And so, he's making these three arguments, these negative consequences. And then I think this is where a lot of people got confused about what you were saying. So let's listen to what you say in response, and maybe you can help clarify a little bit about what you were talking about there.
Okay. That what is at stake is, this is what you see when you have someone who is operating outside of his own field of expertise. John's field would be government and ethics. And now he's dealing with biblical criticism and texts like this. Had he been reading what other evangelical scholars have been saying about these kinds of things for a long time, he would have recognized that this isn't just Mike Licona saying a lot of these things.
So then you go into detail about how, what you were talking about earlier, there are lots of evangelical scholars that accept what you're trying to say here. And I think a lot of people misinterpreted that as you saying, hey, John is wrong about this because he's not a scholar, because he hasn't read the resources and he hasn't read the books. And it seemed to me, at least, that John interpreted that as the same way, because he starts to talk about, hey, yeah, I'm not a scholar, but I have read all your books, and he starts pulling up all kinds of books and stuff like that. So maybe could you clarify, what was the reason why you mentioned that about that John, he wouldn't be saying what he was saying if he was, reading the literature and was a scholar himself?
Well, first, I want to acknowledge that I think I had a poor choice of words there. And they came across as, it just came across maybe as being pompous or arrogant. And I didn't mean it that way, but I acknowledge that they came across that way. And for that, I'm sorry. It's unfortunate choice of words on my part. But I do think it is evident that, when these folks are accusing me of these kinds of things, and they don't seem to even be aware that people like Blomberg and Bach and Keener and Anderson and Bruce and Carson and others hold some of the same views, many of the same views, and they wouldn't even have a problem with many of the things that I'm saying. I mean, yeah, it's like, well, why are they just coming out against me on this? It's aren't you reading what these other guys are doing? Well, probably not. Now, I don't blame them for that. I'm not reading the politics and government stuff and ethics stuff that John deals with. I'd be totally out of my lane I mean, I comment sometimes on political things on Facebook, and I make errors with it because I don't go in as deeply and consider these things as deeply as I do with like historical Jesus stuff and New Testament stuff. So because I'm not as passionate about, I'm not nearly as passionate about political stuff as I am on the Jesus stuff and the New Testament things. So because I don't live in that, I'm going to make some errors. I'm going to tend to believe and just look at one side a little more carefully than the other. And that's my fault. And I'm going to make mistakes with that way. So I know when I started studying this stuff and seeing what Plutarch, I read through Plutarch's lives 3 times, all 48 of the extant ones. And, made notes and outlines of everything that was discussed in each one and compared where this story was it told in this one and this one, and spent a lot of time in it. And as I was glad that I was wise enough to run some of the things that I were saying past a few classicists before I published the stuff, because they were able to point out some errors that I made in my understanding. It's like I was doing it, I think, well, I studied the ancient world, with Jesus and some with Judaism. So naturally, I'm going to know stuff about the Greeks and the Romans, right? No, the way Roman politics worked is different than say American politics works, and you can make. I would have made some howlers, some real nasty or bad errors that a classicist would have looked at and just laughed at and said, "This guy is really sophomoric." So why? Because I was dealing with things in a discipline that's not my own. So I didn't mean to sound elitist, but I understand how it came across that way. And for that, I do regret. But the point still stands that when I try not to speak on issues like, on this kind of stuff that's outside of my area of expertise. But I find that that's what a number of others are doing. That doesn't mean they're wrong, okay? They could still be right. I could still be wrong. But I think we have to acknowledge that when you have not spent as much time in an area, like I haven't spent nearly as much time studying the Gospel of John as someone like Craig Keener or Paul Anderson or Craig Blomberg. So I'm going to be really careful about some of the things I say, because the more you study this stuff, the more you realize you don't know. And just you try to nuance the things that you say a little bit more carefully.
Right. And it's interesting because you actually did a video with Braxton Hunter and Jonathan Pritchett before this debate, I believe. I'm pretty confident it's before the debate. And you said nearly the exact same thing that you did in your response to what Sean McDowell was like, hey, respond to these arguments. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting, because I think that in the full context of things, that you realize that, hey, you get a lot of hate for this, and if people just realize, hey, you're not the only one saying this, then it would calm a lot of tensions down and help people realize, hey, you're not you're not as radical. And not only that, but to clarify even further, you think that this is about genre and ancient writing practice, not denying truth, which is what West was saying there. Additionally, when West mentioned the slippery slope argument, that was in a way a response to that as well, because you're saying, hey, there's all kinds of Christian scholars that think that what I'm saying is not crazy, and that's evidence that when you get on this quote unquote slippery slope, that you don't actually go that far. And I hate to talk too much, but another point that you make,
I do think that same-sex marriage is wrong. I believe it's sinful. In fact, I'll even go further than a lot of evangelicals do. I'm a complementarian as well. So, I mean, I'm fairly conservative in my
Hmm.
biblical doctrine.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Something that you make a really good point in a number of different books and videos and stuff like that, or at least one book that I can remember, is that you say that we're all on. Anybody could be said they're on a slope.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
for example, the King James only people would say that West is on a slope to, all the crazy stuff because he rejects the King James only as the only inerrant translation, right? So, we can all say that, but the question is, what are the arguments for that, and what is the evidence that that's something that's actually going to happen?
That's right. And everybody thinks they're at the top of the slope, right?
Everybody.
Everybody, we all think that we have it right. And yeah.
Mhm.
And as I pointed out, when you're on a hill and there's a slope, hills usually have two sides to it, two slopes. And I think the slope on John's side and those like him, the grade is a lot steeper. So when you tell someone, I'm not saying John says this, okay,
Mhm.
but if you tell someone the Bible is God's speech in written form, and so therefore, and it was dictated. Now John doesn't think it was dictated, okay, but so I'm just using this as an example. If you tell someone that inspiration happened, that God dictated the words, which, by the way, the Chicago Statement says that God caused the biblical authors to use the very words that he chose. Now, explain to me how that's different from dictation,
Yeah.
right? The words were divinely constituted. Um, all of Scripture is the product of a single divine mind. So it's like, well, that sounds like dictation to me, even though
Mhm.
they'll deny it. Chicago people will deny it and say, no, we don't believe in divine dictation. Well, you sure describe it in that way 3
Mhm.
times. But let's suppose someone takes divine dictation and then they say, well, it's divine dictation. So if there's any error in Scripture, then you can't trust any of it. Um, that sets a person up, like I said previously, that sets a person up to fall. So then when they discover some things in Scripture that they can't reconcile, like Mark's poor grammar, or Luke's editorial fatigue, or Paul's memory lapse, they take a step down that slope, and because it is so steep, they stumble and they go rolling down that hill at a very much faster pace than a person who would say, oh, all right, I'm allowing some of these compositional devices. And so they took a step down that slope,
Mhm.
you could say.
Yeah, that's a really, really good metaphor there. So, this next section, I'll just summarize real quick. So West basically was like, hey, I'm a generalist. I'm not a biblical scholar, but you had the chance to interview biblical scholars. And he mentions Lydia McGrew. And then you respond later and you're like, hey, well, I've had plenty of discussion with Lydia McGrew. I don't really have a specific reason to have to debate her one-on-one. It's out there. Nobody needs to see that. And then he also brought up Bill Roche. And I'm not really familiar with him or what his expertise is. Could you talk about, it's okay if not, but could you talk about why you supposedly, I don't know if you even did, but supposedly why you rejected a debate with Bill Roche?
Yeah. So I don't have a lot of experience with Bill. He reminded me of some times I met him that I didn't remember. I think he's telling the truth. I just didn't remember them. I'm sure he's a great guy. So I don't want to say anything negative about him. What I would say is he, I was alerted to an article, a journal article he published in, I think it was a South African journal, where he took me to task on the gospel differences thing. And he would quote a text, trying to think, Jacobus Erasmus, Cobus Erasmus, he alerted me to the article, and he's got 2 PhDs, one in philosophy, one in theology.
Hmm.
And he said, Mike, are you familiar with this article with Bill Roach where he's criticizing you? He says, this guy really is, He said, the scholarship isn't that good. He really misrepresents you. So I read the article, and he really does misrepresent me. I mean, he'll quote a paragraph out of my big book on the resurrection. Maybe it was on my resurrection book, not on gospel differences, but he quoted he quoted a paragraph out of my big book on the resurrection. He said, see, Licona, he doesn't believe in a correspondence theory of truth. Well, if you read that same page, I'm arguing for a correspondence theory of truth. And there were several occasions within that journal article where it just showed that he wasn't reading my book carefully at all, and he just misrepresented me. And so Cobus and I wrote a response journal article to it, and we got it published. And then, he's saying this stuff about J.I. Packer, who disagreed with me. And so now I get together with Dan Wallace, Greg Minette, Paul Copan, George Sinclair, who were all present at these conversations that I had with J.I. Packer. And we had agreed, J.I. Packer had just turned 90 or was about to turn 90 at the time. And these were on two separate occasions, but 1 month apart, that these conversations took place, and at two different conferences in Vancouver, Canada. And we agreed because at that point he was like 1 month from becoming 90, turning 90, and the other he had just turned 90, and he just wanted to stay out of the whole conversation. He wanted to stay out of debate. He said, I just want to live peacefully. And we respected that. And so we agreed outside of his presence that we would not mention our conversations with J.I. Packer until at least he died. And even after he died, we did not just come out and mention anything. And then even after Norm Geisler died, we didn't mention any of it. We thought there's just no need to do this. Even though the things that Packer had said in the presence of all of us was not positive about Norman Geisler. And some of the things that he revealed, but we just said, we just don't want to do it. There's no need to do it. Geisler isn't coming after me anymore, because he's gone to be with the Lord, and let's just let this die. But then Bill Roach is coming up and he's saying, J.I. Packer came out against Licona and all that. And so well, I got together with Dan Wallace and Paul Copan and George and Greg, and I said, this is what Roach is doing. So, why don't we just clear it now? Why don't we just bring this stuff up? Because we had taken notes. And after we took those notes, we passed them around to make sure that the note taker had said the right thing. And we verified it on the spot right after we had been in Packer's presence. And so I came out with a video where I'm interviewing Paul and Dan and Greg on what Packer had actually said. And it's like, it completely contradicted what Bill Roach had said and brought out some stuff that no one else knew because they weren't there and we hadn't revealed it, of what had actually happened behind the scenes. And it's like, okay, Bill didn't accept that. And even John on that on the thing with the dialogue I had with him with Sean, he said, well, how do we know you guys are telling the truth? It's like, okay, well, if that's the way you guys want to do it, if that's what Bill is saying, and he said, Bill Roach on one of his, I responded in a video to Bill, with this, and if that's the way Bill wants to conduct himself, and he's welcome to do that. He misrepresented me several times. He's not a careful scholar in this regard. I think he just got really emotional about it, and I mean, this can happen to all of us, right? You read a Facebook post and you don't even read the whole thing and you're already writing your response, right? Because you're emotional about it. And maybe that's what Bill did. And look, that's okay if that's what he wants to do. But when you get to the point when, okay, well, maybe maybe Mike and Dan Wallace and Paul Copan and George Sinclair, who knew Packer personally and spent time with him, had known him for years, had been a student of Packer at one point before he became an Anglican priest, and Greg Minette. All five of us eyewitnesses to what Packer had actually said. We were there. And then I could talk about private conversations between just Packer and me. And Bill saying, stop lying about Packer. It's like, okay, I have the ability, the freedom to choose the people I'm going to have a dialogue with. And I just chose, I just don't want to do it with Bill.
Yeah. So from West's perspective, it seems like maybe he's just not aware of that, or
he probably wasn't aware of that. So
Yeah.
I'm not blaming West for that.
Right.
And I said to him, look, you're the one that came out and criticized me in your book. That's why we're talking.
Yeah. So he's trying to. I don't know why. I don't know what would lead someone to so strongly try to say something like that. But it seems like he's just saying, "Hey, you're scared to debate actual scholars, but you're willing to debate me." Or that's at least the impression he gave. I don't know if that's what he was trying to do.
Yeah.
Long story short, from your response here, I don't see any reason to think that you are afraid to debate an actual scholar or something like that, even though Bill Roche is not a scholar on the topic of the Gospels or contradictions, even though he's written a couple papers critiquing you.
I'd say, he's a scholar in terms of being a theologian, and, he can talk about inerrancy and things like that. But, I just don't like, I'm not trying to be a baby or anything, but it's like, I'm a busy guy and I can choose who I dialogue with. Now, Lydia McGrew, West mentioned her. I think Lydia is a brilliant person. Her IQ is off the charts. She's smarter than I am. I don't think she knows the topic that we're discussing as well as I do. I would have some of the same criticisms of her that I have of Bill Roche, although not as, I think Roche has gone further in a bad way. I wish Lydia the best. I did respond to her in 8 videos. I spent 3 months, almost full time, engaging with her work personally, and then doing response videos. I said, well, why not go, one-on-one with her? And I'd say, I think Lydia's a great person, probably a godly woman. I don't know her all that well, but it just seems like our personalities, for one reason or another, it's like trying to mix oil and water. And maybe some things like that is just best doing it in writing and or video. And so that's what I did. And after that 3 months, I did my 8 response videos. And at the end, I said, I'm done now. I'm moving on. I don't want to keep doing this and going back and forth, back and forth. Here's my response. Read her stuff, read my stuff. Read her criticisms of me, read my response to it, and make your own decision. And it was funny. I forgot where it was, but I was at a conference, and at lunch, I went and I just hung out with some of the conference attendees, and I was sitting at a table with a guy who was a chapter director for a campus ministry. I'm not going to mention which one. And he said, Dr. Licona, why won't you debate Lydia McGrew? I said, well, I have responded to her. He said, yeah, but why don't you debate her? And I said, well, I just decided that I thought it'd be better if I just gave a very in-depth criticism, my response to her work. Have you watched the 8 videos? It only take you 3.5 hours to watch all 8 of them. Or if you'd rather read, I have a polished transcript of all 3 of those, of all the 3.5 hours. I have a polished transcript with footnotes on it. you could read that and said, have you spent any time with that? And he said, no. And I said, debates take time. I have to review notes. You know, there's so much literature here, so much stuff here to know. Why are you requiring me to do that when you won't even take 3.5 hours? I've already taken 3 months of my life to devote to this, and you will not take 3.5 hours to see my response and reflect on it? I said, are you being lazy and just want entertainment? And he said, well, you're right. I should do that. And so anyway, no, I'm not. Look, I've been in the ring now, debate ring with Bart Ehrman 8 times. I debated Elaine Pagels at Princeton. We had a debate on the Gospel of Thomas. I've had 2 debates with Dale Martin, a senior. He died a couple of years ago, but he was a senior New Testament scholar at Yale University. Shabir Ali, debated him 2 or 3 times, the leading, or at least at that time, is the leading Muslim debater in the world. You know, these are the kind of people that I've debated. I've debated Larry Shapiro on 3 occasions, a philosophy professor atheist philosophy professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison. I mean, I just go on. Obviously, I'm not afraid to debate these folks. It's just, I am stingy with my time, and I want to redeem the time and do what I think's
Right.
going to best contribute to the kingdom. And I just don't think some of those things are going to do it.
Yeah. So a good amount of this conversation was specifically about Matthew 27. And so right after Jesus dies on the cross in Matthew 27, 52 to 53, it says, and the tombs broke open, the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came home. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. And yeah, so obviously a lot of the conversation was about this. Can you give us your argument for why you think that the resurrection of the saints might not be describing something that historically happened?
Sure. So when I'm doing my doctoral research, I come across, and I'm interacting with John Dominic Crossan's work on it. And he likes to bring up the raised saints. And he says, well, we've got something like this in the Odes of Solomon, which is 2nd century. It's a 2nd century hymnal from the early Christians and from Jews. There are some of
Be able
it
to
that have
respond if I
some.
might on the resurrection of the other saints.
Oh, you're playing that. Is that what
Oh.
you want to play that?
No,
first?
I didn't mean to play it. Sorry. Keep
Okay.
on going.
So the Odes of Solomon, it's got some Christian, it's got some Jewish, maybe a few hymns that are kind of Gnostic flavoring, that, although that's disputed. So it's an ancient hymnal, and it has one of the hymns talk about these saints raised at Jesus' death. And so what Crossan, and he also appeals to some artwork from a few centuries later, and he thinks that this is all just myth, and that the resurrection of Jesus is much the same, you could say. And so I was addressing that. And as I'm reading, there's a number of commentaries that don't even like to deal with it. They just talk about it, but they don't want to get in depth with it and say much about what this is. Is it historical or whatever? But I was reading Raymond Brown's the volume, The Death of the Messiah, and he had an interesting position in there. He quoted a bunch of Greco-Roman and Jewish writing. Josephus, for example, Josephus mentions that just before the temple was destroyed, a number of portents occurred. So there was at around midnight, there was a light that shone down on the temple that was brighter than the brightest part of the day. That the gates to the temple, the Jerusalem temple, Jewish temple in Jerusalem, which took 20 men to open by itself. That in the temple complex, a cow gave birth to a lamb, that there was a comet, that there was an eclipse of the sun, that fighting was seen in the heavens, that right before the temple was destroyed again, there was the sound of wind in the temple, and some voices were heard saying, "We are leaving this place." It's like, okay, do I really believe that a cow gave birth to a lamb? Do I believe some of these things? And then when I think it's Cassius Dio, who he's writing about some time during Nero's reign, when something was going on with Nero, that there was an eclipse of the sun, that there were phantoms that were seen in the woods, that fighting was seen in the heavens, that there was a woman, a giant woman with snakes as hair, was seen walking around the city, and she was horrifying. That the gates to the temple of Zeus, which took many men to open, opened by themselves. There was an eclipse of the sun, a comet. And then you read a number of sources. There were numerous sources that I think 6 or 7 that reported portents when Julius Caesar died. A lot of them reported an eclipse of the sun, a comet. That seemed to be common parlance of these kind of portents that were reported. Virgil, who was a poet, a Latin poet, he reports that when Caesar was assassinated, there's like 13 portents that took place. Mount Etna erupted. There was darkness. There was a comet. That pale phantoms were seen walking around at sunset. Isn't that interesting? When you know, with the parallel with the raised saints, when Jesus died at 3 p.m. And the darkness. Virgil also reports that fighting was seen in the heavens, that black intestines were seen outside of cattle. I mean, I look at these things, and I think Brown was onto something when he said he thinks that these were, these portents, that some of them may have occurred, but some of them may have been fictional and added for effect. Dan Reed, who was my acquisitions editor at IVP Academic, they took my big book on the resurrection. He called them special effects. And I thought, well, that's kind of an interesting way of putting it. And I thought, it's kind of like us today saying 9/11 was an earth-shaking event. We don't mean to say that there was an actual earthquake that took place. By saying it was an earth-shaking event, that is just special effects fictionally added, a figure of speech, you could say, rhetoric, in order to highlight the immensity of what happened on 9/11 here in the United States. And in 2022, I have a friend who is a retired pathologist who ministers to Muslims, shares the gospel with Muslims. And she attended a Persian New Year's festival near Denver in 2022. So you've got all these Persians here together in 2022. And in the midst of this, the moderator stopped everything at one point and called everybody's attention to a famous Persian singer, a famous Persian singer who died in a car wreck 2 years prior, and said, when that happened, the stars fell out of the sky and the sun turned black. It's like they're still doing it today in Middle Eastern culture. So, Peter does it at Pentecost when they're speaking in tongues and people present say, you guys are filled with new wine. And Peter says, no, this is what Joel the prophet predicted. He prophesied, young men will have visions, old men will have dreams, and the Spirit of the Lord will come, and whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved in that day. Well, what's real interesting when you read that context in Joel chapter 2, Yep, talks about young men having dreams, young men having visions, old men having dreams. There will be blood, smoke, and fire, and the sun will go dark, and the moon will turn into blood. And there will be all kinds of wonders in the heavens and on earth, and whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. That is the text that Peter appeals to explain speaking in tongues on Pentecost. I mean, if we were there, do we think that we would have seen the moon turn to blood, that the sun would have gone dark, and blood, smoke, and fire would have been there, and wonders in the heavens and on earth? It seems to me that this is more plausibly explained as special effects, portents. And so what I posited is maybe this is what's going on with Matthew when he's talking about the saints being raised. Now, why would I say that? Because you got theological challenges. These saints that are allegedly raised, why is it that hardly any of the early church fathers report them? It seems like Ignatius may be aware of them. But other than that, you have Origen, but he says that, well, you had some, they were raised, but they didn't go into Jerusalem. They went to the holy city in heaven. But most of them don't even mention it. They'll mention the darkness. They may mention the earthquake or the temple veil, but they don't mention the raised saints, the early church fathers. And then you've got, are these raised saints? Who are they? Are they, what would a person have seen had they been there? Would they have seen these? They don't come out of their tombs until after Jesus is raised. So if you'd been there, would they have been pacing back and forth in their tombs? They come out of their tombs, they haven't eaten or drank anything for over 40 hours. So they're hungry, they're thirsty, they're homeless. They would have had some really cool near-death experiences, but we don't hear anything about them. Were they raised in a resurrection body like Jesus? Well, if that's the case, then that contradicts what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:20, that Christ is the first fruits of those who sleep. In other words, he's the first to be raised with a resurrection body. But if they were raised with a resurrection body, then their resurrection preceded that of Jesus, and that would have contradicted Paul. The other option is that they're raised in the same kind of body as they died in, like Lazarus or Jairus' daughter or the widow's son, only sometime in the future to die again. But again, if that's the case, then they're the hungry, thirsty, homeless. Why is it we really just don't even hear anything about these people, or they would have had some really interesting stories? So I think to me, it sounded, rather than myth making like Crossan would say it was, it just, I think it's, you're just reading it, that Crossan was reading it wrong, incorrectly. He should have been reading it more like Josephus and Virgil, more as poetic devices meant to highlight an event of cosmic, even divine significance. They've just killed the Son of God. That makes more sense to me. But let me just say one more thing, and I can say it quickly. Someone could rightly then say, well, then how do we know that the early proclamation that Christ is raised from the dead, how do we know that that wasn't just more of the same? And I'd say, well, that's real easy. Because the disciples, or let's say Paul, the earliest one that we have mentioning this, he says in 1 Corinthians 15, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless. This isn't special effects. It's not a poetic device. Christ, according to Paul, is the first fruits of the general resurrection, and that is inextricably tied to our resurrection in the general resurrection when Jesus returns. So what Paul, in essence, is saying in 1 Corinthians 15 is, if Christ has not been raised, we're not going to be raised. If we're not going to be raised, then this life is all there is. The Christian life is not worth living because it often involves persecution and sacrifice. And so Paul says, let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. And that makes sense. But for Paul, Christ was raised. Therefore, we will be raised. Therefore, the Christian life is worth living, even if it involves persecution and sacrifice. And that makes no sense whatsoever. That argument makes no sense of Paul's whatsoever, unless he and the apostles meant that Jesus' resurrection was factual. It was an event that occurred in history. So that's my view of the raised saints.
I appreciate you going into that. So Dr. West, he seems to make a few arguments against this position, and it's kind of tailored towards, I guess, your view of an inerrancy. So essentially, what it seems like what you're saying is, hey, this isn't describing an error because it's just describing a, a way of communicating, like hyperbole. Nobody says hyperbole is an error. So in that way, it's a pretty simple understanding of I guess inerrancy. But Wes says a few things to that. And I wanted to see what your thoughts were on that. So first of all,
Because part of what seems to be going around is that, well, people actually seeing things in nature and then making a theological interpretation of that means that they must have invented it, that those things didn't really take place in nature. And that's a very anti-supernatural bias that actually comes straight out of the 19th century and before of the higher critics. And so this is actually a good example of why I raised what I do about Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, of sincere Christians who are in fact getting some of their underlying assumptions from these basically non-Christian points of view. But
so I don't know about you. I didn't hear anything in your argument for this being some type of figure of speech or literary device of with these raising of the saints. I didn't hear anything about supernatural things can't happen. Right, you're a Christian, so obviously you believe supernatural things happen. You didn't give anything related to that argument, but I'm just curious. What are your thoughts on that? Do you have some type of anti-supernatural bias that you're not aware of?
Well, if I'm not aware of it, then I wouldn't be aware if I had it. But,
That's true.
No, it's like, I don't remember who it was, but someone criticized my critics who were saying the same thing about my big book on the resurrection, that I had an anti-supernatural bias. And they said, are you kidding? He wrote this big volume of 700 and some pages arguing that Jesus rose from the dead. So how can they say I have a supernatural bias? No, I think Jesus performed miracles. I think divine prophecy on his part. I think some of the gifts of the Spirit still occur today, though I think that there's a lot of chicanery with it. I do think that some of the gifts of the Spirit still occur today. Prophecy, speaking in tongues, and healings and things like this. I think Jesus rose from the dead. I think miracles. I think that there are occasions when people are raised from the dead today. Craig Keener documents some in his book on miracles, his 2 volumes. I think that the blind can still see and be healed. Francis Chan said he witnessed it personally when he was out in the bush somewhere in some foreign country. And he was preaching the gospel, and there was an interpreter, and he said, God laid it on his heart that there were some deaf and blind kids that were there listening to him. I guess the deaf ones weren't listening, but they were there. And he felt prompted by God to go over and heal them. He said, I've never done anything like this before, but he did, and they were healed. And many in the village became Christians as a result. So no, I'm totally for these things happen. All I'm trying to do, Zach, is I'm trying to read the text as the original authors meant for it to be understood. So it's like the psalmist, one of the psalmists says, ask God to awaken from his sleep. Another psalmist says that God never sleeps. So is that a contradiction? No. You got to take into consideration genre and poetic speech, rhetorical devices. Or I remember there's a neat statement that Bruce Metzger said regarding Revelation. He says, the text doesn't mean what it says. It means what it means. That's pretty interesting. The text doesn't mean what it says. It means what it means. So when Revelation chapter 12, I believe it is, when it mentions a great red 7-headed dragon whose tail is going to sweep 1/3 of the stars to the earth, is that referring to a real space monster? Well, I put that question to, I'm not going to mention his name, but a very conservative theologian. And that theologian said, yes, Yes, that's a real space monster. Well, I think that is what, I mean, it's obvious when you read through Revelation and you just go a little bit longer, that dragon is just symbolic of Satan, is all that is. That's crystal clear in the text. And I think that's what Metzger means by the text doesn't mean what it says. It means what it means. And so I'm just trying to, maybe I'm wrong on some things, Zach. I mean, I could, I'm going to be in heaven someday, and maybe Matthew will come up to me and say, Licona, brother, I know you meant well, but you were wrong. Those saints were raised at Jesus's death. Okay, Matt, appreciate, I was wrong. I could be wrong in these. I'm just trying to treat the text to do a decent job with it. And I'm still convinced that was a literary device that Matthew was using.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So another objection, Dr. West, is he a doctor? I don't even know.
He is.
Yeah. So he brings up this idea that the text is in what he would call historical narrative, so that it's in a narrative. And what you're saying is that this one specific section is not historical, but the rest, I would assume what you're saying is a lot of the other parts are historical. And that it seems like he's saying, well, that doesn't really fit. So specifically, he says it actually makes not just, well, the stars are following specific claims about both an earthquake and the temple, the curtain being rent and ripped, and then there were actually, people rise, and then they went out and people saw them. So, you can assert that, well, that's just special effects, but it's embedded in historical narrative. So in other words, when you got all this different stuff going on, then it seems like you should interpret it as historical. So what do you think about that?
Well, it seems to me we have something similar like that going on in Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. If I were to say 9/11 was an earth-shaking event, I mentioned a historical event, but I'm using that kind of rhetoric there. What happened at that Persian New Year's festival out near Denver, they were doing the same thing, right? They were talking about a real event about this famous entertainer, this singer who died in a car wreck, and yet they used this phenomenological language in order to describe it. Now, here's something else. John Ramsey, he's a classicist, now retired. He's emeritus professor of Greek and classics at the University of Illinois in Chicago. He's an expert on Cicero and Sallust and Asconius. And he'll be soon with, I believe, Loeb Classical Library. He did the Loeb Classical Library series on Sallust, and he's doing it on Asconius. And and he's a believer. He's a brother in Christ. I've since gotten to know him. He's become a dear friend. Just an amazing guy. I have the highest regard for him. And before I even knew him, my wife alerted me to a book that he had written. It was like back in 2006, I think it was. And it's not going to be a bestseller. It was a monograph titled something like a catalog of Greco-Roman a catalog of comets in the Greco-Roman literature from 500 BC to 400 AD. One of those expensive monographs. And so he located as many instances where in the Greco-Roman literature they mentioned a comet during that period. And he provides every reference, and he shows it in the original Latin or Greek literature, and then he translates it into English. And as I read through that catalog of many instances, it's interesting that in some cases you could actually verify that the comet was visible at that time, because we knew what a certain comet like Halley's Comet or the Hale-Bopp Comet or Hale-Bopp Comet, Halley's Comet, or another known comet, that it would have appeared at that time, during that time. So they knew that was historical, the comet. But there are a few cases, Zach, when it actually combines a comet with an eclipse of the sun. And what's really interesting is NASA has a website. NASA has a website that I'm sorry about the text. Let me silence that, at least on my phone. NASA has a website where you can enter the year and then select a region, and it will tell you whether there was an eclipse that was visible in that region that year. And there are a couple of instances when we can verify that there was a comet that they would have seen in that region, but there was no visible eclipse of the sun, which strongly suggests that the author added the eclipse for effect. So it could be that you've got some things like that Mark and Luke report. John, interesting, doesn't report any of them at Jesus's death. I would think of all the authors, he would have done it, but he doesn't report any of them. Mark and Luke report the darkness and the temple veil splitting, but Matthew's the only one that reports the other four: the earthquake, the tombs, the rock split, the tombs opening, and the dead, many of the saints raised. So could Matthew have added those, like some of the ancient authors added an eclipse? Ultimately, we don't know, but I do think that there's some good reason to think that Matthew did add some of these things for effect. And again, in the ancient literature, Greco-Roman literature, we see them probably doing that by adding an eclipse. When a comet was visible, they highlighted, they amplified it by adding an eclipse. And I do think that Luke does this in the book of Acts with Pentecost.
Yeah. So West made a number of different arguments against your positions here. He basically said, hey, your view couldn't be possible because he didn't use exact words, but he basically said, yeah, this wouldn't be true because before postmodernism, no Christians accepted your view on this specific thing. Do you have any thoughts on that?
On the raised saints or the other stuff?
Yeah, raised saints.
The raised saints? Well, I can say that William Lane Craig and Michael Bird adopted this position before I did, and I didn't even realize that they had. And Raymond Brown did as well. Did any of the early church fathers? I think I might be inclined to think that Ignatius thought that they were historical. Origen, it's a little bit different. And again, most of the early church fathers don't even talk about it. They'll talk about the darkness or the temple veil splitting, but they ignore the raised saints. And so why did they ignore them? Why did they not mention them? Did they disbelieve them? Or they just, for one reason or another, didn't mention them? I don't know.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so in other words, what you're saying is if people didn't even really comment on it, then how can we even be confidently saying that they actually rejected your view? Or maybe, who knows? I don't know. In my experience, I think that the early church fathers believe a lot of wild things, some good things,
about that.
Right? But a lot of wild things. So I think that once you realize just the breadth and exhaustive nature of some of the wild claims, a lot of the arguments are like, oh, well, nobody believed that before you did, really aren't as strong as people realize. But even though that's John's not specifically saying that. But anyway, so thank you so much for coming on there. It's really been helpful and interesting and educational. Did you have any last thoughts before we go?
Well, sometimes, we talk about some of these things in our courses at Houston Christian University. And if someone really wants to get in, to go in depth with some of this stuff, check out our MA in Christian Apologetics at HCU. Just go to hc.edu/defend. And this is something that you can even do the degree online if you'd like.
Awesome. That is an apologetics degree I would get behind. So awesome. I really appreciate you coming on here. It's been a pleasure. And otherwise, to my audience, make sure you like and subscribe. Let me know what you thought in the video, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.